From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Trump says he's talking about possible trade deals with several nations, but reciprocal tariffs will still take effect at midnight, including a combined 104% tariff on China. Beijing now promising to fight to the end. We're joined by former U.S. Ambassador to China, Gary Locke.
And we'll talk with Lindsay Owens at the Groundwork Collaborative about the potential economic implications of the tariffs on consumers and businesses as Wall Street finishes a volatile day in the red.
And as the president signs an executive order to revive the coal industry, we're joined by West Virginia Senator Jim Justice, live from the White House.
Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday evening. And we do begin with the president's actions this afternoon, signing multiple executive actions taking aim at the coal industry, including this one.
Earlier this afternoon, I signed another executive order to strengthen our electric grid by ensuring that coal-fired power plants are always available to meet surging demand for electricity. Unlike wind and solar, coal plants can run 24 hours a day in rain, sleet, or snow.
Joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Hadriana Lowenkron, who covers the White House for us. So obviously he had a lot to say on energy this afternoon, but he's still trickled some tariffs into his remarks as well, as that has really been dominating the conversation here in Washington and elsewhere.
Absolutely. So, quickly on the energy, because tariffs, news of the day, as expected. So essentially what is happening here is the admin is moving to expand coal mining in the U.S. This is something that the president has campaigned on and vowed to do. And he, of course, brought in the Secretary of Energy and the Interior. And he was in front of a bunch of different coal workers and really kind of this showy support for the industry there. Of course, cheered by people in the coal space, but frowned upon by some advocates in the environmental space. But did, of course, take some time in that speech to mention, as you said, some of the countries that he has spoken to try to negotiate, in a sense, these tariffs that we are, as of now, expecting to come into effect tonight. But will that happen? Anything could happen, essentially, between now and midnight, although that is what the White House is signaling.
No, they say the phone's been ringing. Up to 70 countries calling to engage in negotiations. China is the sticking point, though, right? We already mentioned this, and we're going to talk to Gary Locke about this in a moment. The president put up a truth social aimed at China today, referring to negotiations with South Korea. He says they're already on the plane to Washington. Waiting for their call was the Post. Are they calling? Will he hear from Beijing?
Right, that is the question here. I mean, the countries that we've already mentioned, Japan, South Korea, Israel yesterday, while I was in the Oval, these are countries that he is hearing from. But the one that he cares the most about, it seems, has not yet put in that call. And that's why we are expecting these tariffs to come into tonight. But in the meantime, these markets, of course, very volatile. There's still some mixed messaging here on whether the point of these tariffs is supposed to be something permanent or a place for the negotiations. And so, the White House is saying that two things could happen at the same time. I asked yesterday if it's possible to negotiate below the minimum 10%, and he didn't answer on that. So there's still so much uncertainty about what exactly this idea of a negotiation means. Yeah,
and that's coming from a reporter who's actually in the room with the president. Bloomberg's Hadriana Lowenkron, many thanks for being with us again on Balance of Power. As we turn now to today's market upheaval, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic live with us from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. Romaine, this is getting to be a habit, and I'm sorry it's for all the wrong reasons here. I wonder if it's worse news that we had another down day or the fact that rally this morning fizzled. Yeah, it was kind of interesting. You say upheaval. At one point, it looked like today was going to be a day of celebration. The S&P 500 actually opened higher by about 2.5%. At one point on the day, it was up 4%.
And then, I don't know, around midday, it just kind of lost steam and ended up closing down by about 1.5%, at one point being down as much as 3%. We should point out that type of volatility, Joe, is not normal for the world's largest stock market. But more importantly, it gets to this idea of what drove that rally at the start. A lot of people said it was simply short covering, no real fundamental change in policy, no real fundamental change in economic conditions. In fact, you have Larry Summers out predicting recession. You have Nouriel Roubini, Dr. Doom, also saying, look, don't expect the Fed to come save us. And I posed this question to several of our guests on the close earlier today about what would actually legitimately fuel a new rally. And they said one thing and one thing only, and that was a change in policy direction from the White House. And we had a chance to catch up with the Deputy Treasury Secretary earlier today, and I did not get the sense that there was any change coming anytime soon.
Well, especially as it pertains to China, the White House is not signaling any movement, Romaine. And I do wonder about the action we saw in Chinese affiliated markets today, whether you're looking at the NASDAQ Golden Dragon China Index, which was down hard again today, or the offshore yuan. Pretty incredible to see that at a record low. And
that's key. Pay attention to that. I know it gets kind of complicated understanding why it moved the way it moved. It is now at a record low relative to the dollar. Basically, it weakened today. But more importantly, for our viewers need to understand that the yuan is tightly managed by the Chinese government. So to see a drop like this, the implication is that the central bank over there in China allowed this to happen. And that's going to be a big part of the trade war, if you will, between the two largest economies. It's not just about tariffs. It's not just about the goods that go across the oceans there. It's also about our currencies and whether that becomes the next battlefront in whatever's going on between the U.S. and China, and more importantly, what's not going on between Trump and Xi Jinping.
Yeah, the administration's made it clear it views currency manipulation as one of those non-tariff barriers it's been talking about. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick joining us from New York. Thank you so much. And we'll still have more ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This morning on Bloomberg Surveillance, Stephen Miran, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, joined to discuss the possibility of a recession. We've been hearing the R word a lot against the backdrop of this tariff program, but began by discussing China's policy when it comes to trade, something we're going to be focused on throughout this hour. Here's a piece of that conversation.
I think China's policy has been to try and, sort of steal all the manufacturing market share for themselves, not only from the United States, but for many of our trading partners as well. And, it seems to me unlikely that China would be willing to make that concession up front. However, I would welcome it.
So China said yesterday they will withdraw. Trump said yesterday, that if China does not withdraw the retaliatory tariffs, the U.S. will impose an additional 50%, less than 24 hours, starting tomorrow. Do you expect those additional 50% tariffs to come into play?
I think that depends on the Chinese. And, my advice to them would be that they have a lot more to lose than America does, that America holds the leverage, and everybody knows that, and therefore they should seek a détente, and they should offer concessions which would persuade the president to relent.
Uncertainty might be a good negotiating tactic, but it's really bad for business. That's been the message from a lot of corporate executives. And what you're seeing certainly in markets, are you worried that U.S. companies are going to stop investing, that could stymie some of the progress that you're hoping to engineer?
Yeah, so the president has been very clear that that what he's engaging in is a long-term improvement in the economic welfare of the United States and a long-term improvement in putting American workers on fairer ground vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Some temporary uncertainty will come along with the transition and with the imposition of those policies. That's without a question. However, I think it's important to understand that uncertainty doesn't really cause recessions. I don't think that there's been a recession that was caused by people wondering, what's going to happen tomorrow. Uncertainty can delay decisions, for sure, as you're saying, there could be some transfer of investment decisions, some transfer of hiring decisions from one month to another. That's absolutely possible. But there's limits to that, because eventually a firm is going to decide, hey, I really need to add this capacity, or hey, I really need to make a decision about what's going on. And at some point, waiting becomes not worth it. So is there a chance that the uncertainty causes, sort of distortions in the month-to-month or quarter-to-quarter macroeconomic data that make one quarter look weaker and another quarter look stronger? Absolutely. That's likely, right? If it's not only possible, it's quite likely. But companies can't delay decisions forever. Eventually, they got to pull the trigger and they got to invest based on their evaluation of the most likely policy landscape in the future.
You can find Bloomberg's full conversation with Stephen Miran, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, online or on the terminal. And we want to keep our focus on the White House, specifically what happened there this afternoon as President Trump signed multiple executive orders targeting the energy sector with hopes to revive the nation's coal industry.
From now on, we'll ensure that our nation's critically needed coal plants, as an example, remain online and fully operational. They're always going to be operational. And again, we're going to have guarantees that government cannot close them down, close you down, and destroy your lives.
Joining us now live from the White House on a sunny North Lawn is Republican Senator Jim Justice of West Virginia, who was in the room for that ceremony. He just came out to talk to us on Bloomberg TV and radio. And Senator, I want to welcome you to Bloomberg. It's great to have you with us. We've got a couple of stories we're dealing with here today: coal and tariffs. And I wonder if they have anything to do with each other in the timing of these executive actions, realizing this is something that President Trump promised on the campaign trail. Do tariffs on energy hasten the need for more coal in this country?
I think without any question they hasten the need, because as we go forward, we all know that if you have a steel plant in the United States, if you have coal-fired power plants that are producing wonderful electricity in the United States, absolutely there's no tariffs tied to that whatsoever. We have become so dependent. The coal industry is so dependent upon exported coal and in every way. But with all in me, I can promise you just this. My mom and dad were really proud of coal and really proud of the people of coal. They're craftsmen, they're smart, they're good people and everything. They're the production engine of this country like you can't imagine, and have been that through our world wars and on and on and on. But with that today, I absolutely could have big tears in my eyes, because I can't tell you how proud they would be right now of our president. Now, I absolutely mean this with all my soul. I think the whole world of Donald Trump and his whole family, and have been that way for a long time. And I'm a dear friend, and I will stay that way, rock solid. But today, he is again stepping out and doing something that is great for America. And tying coal to our tariffs and the situation today, I don't think you can tie the two directly together today. But with all that being said, I think as far as the tariffs go, give it time. I mean, this man is a business genius. I'm a business guy. I'm not a politician. I absolutely speak the truth. And with all that, I would just say, give it time. Let's see how this plays out. And if it's a little off kilter, he'll adjust. I know he will. I know him that well.
Well, you may be a businessman, but, Senator, you are a United States senator that represents your constituents in West Virginia. And I do wonder if you're not at all fearful of potential economic blowback on your state of these tariff policies, or more specifically, the retaliatory measures that other countries are taking against the U.S. because of them.
No, I would just say it's perfectly fine. And I'm in the same boat. We're all concerned because the uncertainty is absolutely rampant. But there's no need today in running through the villages with our hair on fire. I mean, come on. Give the man time to do his job. We elected him overwhelmingly. Give him time to do his job. He's a good man. And absolutely, I bet you he'll prove to be right.
Well, of course, some Republicans are already looking for somebody to blame, Senator. During the USTR's hearing this morning, Jamieson Greer was on the Senate side ahead of his House testimony tomorrow. Republican Senator Tom Tillis, your colleague from North Carolina, had this to say about the administration's tariff policy. Let's listen together.
In this scenario, the decision maker who decided the alla prima approach, who has obviously had to have spent time anticipating what we saw in the markets and some of the pushback, I'm assuming this all got gamed out because it's a novel approach. It needed to be thought out. Whose throat do I get to choke if this proves to be wrong?
Whose throat do I get to choke if this proves to be wrong? Senator, is he correct? Was this gamed out?
No, I think it's first of all disrespectful. I think it's just inappropriate in every way and everything. I really believe that it's fair to say we're concerned. To say that we're just absolutely running through the woods so nervous that we don't know which way to turn is ridiculous. To say that this has not been well thought out is totally ridiculous. And with all that being said, I really truly believe, and I'll go back to this every single time, from the standpoint of what we saw today, our president sees exactly the same thing that I see, and that is energy is the key, period. It's all about energy. We should absolutely be absolutely ruling, not necessarily ruling, but we should be a dominant player in energy all across the globe. That's what we did today. You know, Senator Tillis is probably upset in many ways about whatever it may be. I'm okay with him being concerned. I'm not okay with him being disrespectful.
Well, as we consider your points on energy, Senator, obviously there has to be demand for that energy. And we're hearing a lot here on Bloomberg TV and radio about the possibility of a recession or enough of a downward pressure on growth that it will crimp energy demand. Are we about to unleash more supply at a time in which there might not be appetite for it?
Look, as far as I'm concerned, if you're really fair, if we don't watch out and you can take this little guy that's sitting on this stool and take his advice, or maybe you don't choose to. But with all that being said, if we don't do something today, in a year and a half from today, we're going to have to make one of two decisions. We're going to have to choose homes, or we're going to have to choose jobs and energy, or jobs and industry, because we're not going to be able to do both. There's no way. If we don't fix our grid, and we don't really ramp up energy production in this country today, we're going to be in one whale of a mess a year and a half from today. Are we going to have AI? Are we going to have the data centers? Are we going to let China rule? Are we going to awaken to a Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran all together? Are we going to have a national security issue? What's going to happen? And anybody in their right mind that has watched the previous administration bumble around and do everything that they did, how in the world could we possibly not give this man his due and let him absolutely orchestrate which way this country needs to go?
You know, one of the major components of the Trump agenda is, of course, extending the Trump tax cuts, Senator, and this is a process that you're right in the middle of right now with a reconciliation process that's just getting underway on Capitol Hill. There are big questions about how to pay for it, and I realize some of this gets down to a procedural matter, whether we're talking about the current baseline or not. The fact of the matter is there's a discussion about whether to follow through with steep cuts to Medicaid. With 28% of the West Virginia population covered by Medicaid and CHIP, will you keep that from happening in the Senate?
Listen, I do not believe it'll happen. I mean, I really don't believe it'll happen, you know, because I don't believe at the end of the day that Donald Trump is going to hurt our elderly or our kids. I don't believe that at all. You know, and with all in me, in West Virginia, a lot of folks depend on Medicaid, and I would have to be very concerned and look very strongly at it. But I want to just tell you just this. When I walked in the door as governor of West Virginia 8 years ago, plus ago, when I walked in the door, West Virginia was just upside down in many ways, just like our nation's upside down. What did we do? Here's exactly the playbook we did. We cut as much waste as we could possibly cut. We absolutely got rid of unnecessary regulations, all that we possibly could. We kept a flat budget, and we turned ourselves loose to grow. To grow. Absolutely, we had, because any businessman in the world would tell you just this. If you don't mind the store and get rid of the waste, you're doing no job at all. But with all that being said, then you have got to grow revenue. And that's what our president is trying to do right here today. We're trying to grow revenue with energy because we have the cleanest energy in all the world, and every single country all across this globe, every single country, big or small, the more energy they have, the longer their people live and the healthier their people are. Now, come on, absolutely, in America, we don't need to blow our legs off to the pleasing of China's or India's or whomever it may be. You know, absolutely, right now we've got a real opportunity. And as far as the tax breaks, I cut taxes in West Virginia 26 times. We ended up with surpluses like you can't imagine in West Virginia. In every way, West Virginia became the diamond in the rough that everybody missed. You know, absolutely, I am all for getting rid of, making permanency to the tax cuts.
All right, Republican Senator Jim Justice of West Virginia joining us live from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. And as he discusses the prospect of raising revenue, obviously the administration is saying tariffs are one way to do that, though also some deal making perhaps will happen, as the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt had this to say about securing a deal with China specifically earlier today.
He believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States. He believes China has to make a deal with the United States. It was a mistake for China to retaliate. The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder. That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight. But the president believes that she and China want to make a deal. They just don't know how to get that started.
Joining us now is Gary Locke, former U.S. ambassador to China. Ambassador, thanks for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. China has indicated it is not playing games any more than President Trump appears to be. If this actually goes into effect at midnight, what is going to happen to the trade relationship between the two largest economies?
Well, this is really going to hurt consumers and workers on both sides of the Pacific, because so much of what Americans consume every single day, whether it's shoes, clothes, tools, sporting goods, appliances, are made in China. And so if the prices for those items that are purchased by the Costcos and the Walmarts and the Home Depots of the world double in price, you know darn well they're going to pass those increased costs on to everyday consumers. And that means Americans are going to suffer in the pocketbook. At the same time, it means that Americans will buy less from China because they can't afford it. And that means China produces less, which then means higher unemployment for the workers in China. And of course, when China retaliates and puts huge tariffs on American goods, it makes American products less attractive. And therefore, the Chinese don't have to buy our soybeans, don't have to buy Boeing airplanes. They can buy medical equipment from Germany. They can buy soybeans from Brazil. They can buy Airbus.
Well, Ambassador, I'd love for you to bring us to the psychology right now in Beijing. The response that we saw last evening from China's Commerce Ministry, the statement referred to this as blackmail, the U.S. threat to escalate tariffs. China will never accept it. If the U.S. insists on its own way, China will fight to the end. Do you take Beijing at its word?
Well, I think you have two very proud executives, President Trump and President Xi Jinping, and China does not want to be seen around the world as capitulating to what it perceives as reckless, extortionist tactics by America. That's why you're also seeing other countries around the world, some of our closest allies and neighbors, wondering why they're being subject to these tariffs when, in fact, there is no trade surplus by those countries toward the United States, in which America has a trade surplus, let's say, with Australia, and why are they being subjected to these tariffs? And so the same thing with Canada, and the list goes on and on. We've got to figure out a way to get out of this. And let's hope that there are negotiations, that these tariffs can come down, because people on both sides, both countries, the workers and the consumers in all these different countries, including America, are going to suffer.
Well, and it's not just about the tariffs, it strikes me, Ambassador, but other mechanisms through which China could potentially retaliate against the U.S. as well. We all watched as the offshore yuan fell to a new record low against the U.S. dollar today. Would you expect that Beijing is going to potentially look to its currency or look to its practices around U.S. businesses conducting their operations in China as part of this as well?
Well, China has many tools in its toolbox, just as America has tried to not use tariffs, but actually restrict exports of high technology to China, even the banning exports of equipment that could be used to make semiconductors in China, or to say Americans can't invest in some of these technology sectors within China. China can do the same thing. They can actually say that certain items cannot be sold to America, cannot even be brought in from America. And they certainly can say on the grounds of national security, they're not going to allow the sale of their rare earths, their rare minerals to other countries, including America, which these minerals are incredibly necessary for our semiconductors and our high-tech industry.
Ambassador, we've been hearing a lot about tariff evasion from this White House. China sending goods destined for the U.S. through Vietnam, for instance. How widespread is this problem? And if this 104% combined tariff takes effect later, will it actually make a difference?
Well, even under the Biden administration, the Commerce Department was looking at China sending things through other countries, whether it's Vietnam or other things, other areas. And if they were simply repackaging it in another country and slapping that country's label on it and then sending it to the United States, then we would stop that. And we had huge penalties against the Chinese suppliers doing that. And that was true under the Obama administration, Biden administration, and even under President Trump's first administration. But if, for instance, they're actually moving their manufacturing facilities to these other countries, that's legitimate. In fact, American companies are hoping to diversify their supply chain by purchasing these products made in other countries. It may be the product may be the manufacturer may be a Chinese company, but it's being manufactured someplace else. And that's legitimate and that's fair. But to simply slap a label made in X country when in fact it's not, to avoid the tariffs and countervailing duties and things that we impose on Chinese goods, that's not right.
Well, an ambassador, these tariffs on China are not happening in a vacuum. They'll go into effect at the same time reciprocal tariffs across all of the U.S.'s trading partners are. And I wonder if you view that action we're taking, even with allies in some instances, actually may push some of those very same countries toward China and make China somehow, if not a net beneficiary, at least have a bright side to this entire trade war the president has started.
Well, China obviously will try to develop closer economic relations with other countries, encouraging those other countries to set up operations in China. They will try to supply more items to these other countries instead of to the United States. But the United States is still a major destination for Chinese goods, and to be cut off from the American market because of the super high tariffs is going to hurt China, and it will hurt America. But China is going to be looking at other ways in which it can make up the loss of exports to the United States because of these tariffs. Because what happens with these tariffs is that prices are going to double. At least the manufacturers and the companies ordering these products, whether it's sporting goods stores, manufacturers that need components from China, their cost will double. And they can only pass that on to the ultimate purchaser and their consumer. And so it's bad on both sides.
Donald Trump says he's waiting for their call. Ambassador, will he get it?
Well, I'm not sure that the Chinese will make that call. Perhaps it's going to have to be a neutral intermediary, negotiator, third party that tries to bring the two sides together. Donald Trump is not going to make that first call. Xi Jinping is not going to make that first call.
It's great to have you with us at an important moment here. Gary Locke, former U.S. ambassador to China, as we count down to the reciprocal tariffs taking effect. Meantime, the Supreme Court today backing action from President Trump for the third time in less than a week. The justices here blocking a judge's order that required the administration to reinstate fired employees in 6 government departments. giving President Trump at least a temporary win in his effort to reduce the size and scope of the federal workforce. For more on this, we now turn to Bloomberg's Greg Stohr, who covers the Supreme Court for us here in Washington. Greg, it's great to have you with us. An important ruling here. Does that mean that these thousands of workers actually get their jobs back? Do they show up at the office tomorrow?
Not necessarily. This is there are actually a couple cases out there, so it's a little bit complicated, the effect of it. So this is an order that had required these workers to be rehired, thousands of them, and the Supreme Court today blocked that order. And so what it means is that for at least some of them, there'll be the administration could actually fire them. Yeah. For others, because of this other court order, it means that they'll have to be on administrative leave for the time being.
So if all of this is for now, does that also apply to the ruling we got from the court last night as it pertains to the use of the Illegal Alien Enemies Act for the deportation of Venezuelan migrants?
Well, that is certainly not the final word we're going to hear on this thing. So what the court did was it said that the president, it lifted an order, vacated an order that had blocked the president from using this thing called the Alien Enemies Act to deport people. The court did say, however, that people must have an opportunity to go before a judge and say, hey, I'm not a gang member like the administration says I am, and also to challenge the use of this law, the Alien Enemies Act. And there is now a new lawsuit in federal court in New York just filed today where they're making those sorts of arguments. So definitely a win for the administration. We'll have to wait to see both how that other litigation goes and what it means when the court says you have to have an opportunity to go before a judge. There's a lot of details to be worked out there, and we'll have to see, given that so many people were deported seemingly without any sort of an opportunity. We'll have to see what sort of opportunity the administration actually affords them.
We heard from the Chief Justice about Abrego Garcia, which is a case that some have become familiar with after the administration said that it was an error that this person was sent to the prison in El Salvador with these suspected gang members. He will remain in jail, temporarily staying a lower court ruling demanded he be brought back by last night. Will he ever come home?
We don't know yet. So he is in that notorious Salvadoran prison, as best anybody can tell. Yeah. He was sent there along with a few hundred other detainees. And the administration now, as you said, admits that they weren't supposed to do that. There was a court order from an immigration judge that said you can't deport him to El Salvador. That's where he's from. That there's a risk that he will be persecuted there based on his history. The question is whether the Trump administration has given no indication it's going to try to bring him back. The judge ordered the administration to do that, and that order is now on hold. And so we're just going to have to wait to see how this plays out. The Supreme Court could leave that order in place, and then the administration would have to do it, and we'd have questions there. Or the Supreme Court could say, no, the judge went too far with that.
All right, Bloomberg's Greg Stohr, always tracking these cases for us. Thank you so much for joining us. As we're now just about 6.5 hours away from the imposition of reciprocal tariffs on U.S. trading partners, including a 104% levy on Chinese goods that the White House says it will be going with at midnight tonight. So for more on the fallout of these tariffs, the potential economic ramifications, we turn now to Lindsay Owens, Executive Director at the Groundwork Collaborative. Lindsay, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. The White House, while initially saying that this was not a negotiation, has at least opened the door to negotiations with some trading partners, Japan and South Korea, ones that have been discussed thus far. But that isn't going to prevent these tariffs, we understand, from going into effect at midnight, even if they are only in place for a short period of time. How immediate could their economic impact actually be?
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing me on. I mean, it's just been a really devastating few days. And headed into midnight tonight, we're now seeing the triple threat. We've had the broad-based tariffs already go into effect. As you mentioned, we have the supercharged tariffs on China, and now the reciprocal tariffs on more than 60 countries tonight when the clock strikes midnight. There are no surprises here. We know what is going to happen. The cost of goods across the board is going to go up tremendously for American families. This is everything from food and beverages to things that you need to buy for a new baby, like a stroller or a bassinet, to a new car to replace the one that's no longer working. So it's going to be hard for Americans to avoid this. Everyone is going to feel this from all corners.
Curious about damage done, Lindsay. We heard earlier today from Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, on Bloomberg TV and radio, and had this to say about the potential for recovery if the Trump administration turned course or backed off its tariff policy. Here's what he said.
If they backed off these policy errors, I think there would be a substantial resumption of normality. But as long as a hospital maintains unsanitary conditions, its patients get infections when they enter. And as long as these policies are being pursued, we're going to see substantial volatility in markets.
Even if patients aren't getting infections, though, Lindsay, there's still potential for scarring. And I wonder if the White House turned course right now, what would be the residual effects in our economy and in our trade relationships?
Yeah, look, the impacts of this are immediate. And I think, Summers raises a good point, which is that they're entirely man-made. President Trump has inflicted this damage upon the American people across the globe, really, unnecessarily, but unilaterally. This is a decision that he made. This is effectively a policy manufactured recession that we could be headed into. The effects of recessions and big shifts in the market like we've seen over the last few days can be deep and lasting. Remember, for folks on the eve of retirement, right now, they have seen devastating losses to their 401ks and retirement accounts that are going to take a long time to recover, years they may not have left in the market.
Well, and I do wonder as well, Lindsay, about the folks that are still working, are still in the labor market. And if the labor supply or appetite is actually there for this manufacturing renaissance the administration says it intends for these tariffs to bring about, are there really enough people who want to work in these factories that are generating American manufactured products, whether it's assembling iPhones or other things?
Yeah, look, I think the tale of the manufacturing renaissance is really overstated for a couple of really important reasons. The first is, remember, we are still in an incredibly high interest rate environment that makes it tough for folks to put large capital investments on the table. And we learned today that we don't expect to see rate cuts anytime soon. The second thing is everything just got more expensive. That means if you want to start a manufacturing plant, build a factory in this country, everything you need to build it just got more expensive. The headwinds are considerable. But the final thing you need if you're going to build a plant in this country, it's going to take a few years to come online, is you need a little certainty that your bet is maybe going to pay off. And it's impossible to get that certainty right now with the president shifting his position hour by hour, minute by minute, about whether or not he intends for these tariffs to stick and stay the course, or whether if he gets, a phone call or wakes up on the other side of the bed tomorrow morning, he's going to shift course. So it's impossible to make big capital intensive investments right now for a whole host of reasons, but uncertainty from administrative policy is foremost among them.
Well, and even if they do move here, it's going to cost a lot more depending on what it is we're manufacturing. I think to your point here, Lindsay, Dan Ives says you move the iPhone manufacturing chain here to the U.S. and your phone is now going to cost you $3,000. Surely Howard Lutnick knows this as he talks about Americans turning screws into iPhones in a big plant somewhere. Isn't that why so many people are questioning whether these, in fact, are permanent tariffs or just a negotiating tool?
Look, at the end of the day, what we learned today is recession odds are now close to 60%. This is what top analysts are telling us. What that means for the average family is you are at higher risk of losing your job right now. You're at higher risk of retiring with less money in your 401k. And the thing that I think many folks aren't fully appreciating is this may not look like an average recession because you will also be facing higher costs, right? So the price you will pay for things that you need, essentials, will be high. We may have sticky 5% inflation as a result of these tariffs. So this is really a worst case scenario of slowing growth, of increased unemployment, and of high costs across the board, it's really hard to overstate how awful that will be for American families. I mean, I really think the only thing that could possibly make it worse is Congress is working right now overtime to gut the safety net that those Americans who do lose their jobs will depend on. Things like Medicaid coverage for their health insurance if they're unemployed, things like SNAP, food assistance that they'll need to absorb the rising costs of feeding their family on a smaller budget. So the economic outlook is devastating for families. And I think that's why the tariffs are so underwater. I think that's why President Trump's approval rating is so underwater. And I think that's why ultimately there are very few Americans counting on a big manufacturing job right now, and a lot more Americans worrying about what their economic future holds.
Well, the president doesn't just argue it's about bringing in more American manufacturing or stimulating American manufacturing, but also bringing in more revenue to the Treasury's coffers, Lindsay. We've heard administration officials floating figures of some $600 billion a year potentially, but I'm looking at figures from Bloomberg Economics, the Tax Foundation, and Yale's Budget Lab that are half that or less. The implication here being if you raise tariffs, you're going to import less, and that means you have less import levies to actually collect. How does this math come down for you?
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't pencil out any way you look at it. But I'm less concerned about the amount of revenue that the tariffs bring in and more concerned about the theory of taxation underlying them. What we're looking at here is an unbelievably regressive plan. A plan to slash the top tax rates for high-income Americans, slash income tax rates, which are already at historic lows, and then to instead bring in revenue through tariffs, a tax on consumers that are going to hit low-income individuals hardest. And so it's really hard to overstate how regressive the regime change that they are contemplating is by switching to bringing in a large percent of our revenue through tariffs rather than through progressive taxation.
Lindsay, it's great to have you back. She's executive director at the Groundwork Collaborative. Lindsay Owens, thank you as always for the insights. Coming up on Balance of Power, Republican lawmakers pushing forward on their budget blueprint. This happening at the same time tariffs are taking effect, as Lindsay was just discussing. We'll look at what's next with Lisa Camooso Miller, former communications director at the RNC, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This week, we're working in the House to advance the Senate's amendment to our budget resolution, as you know. The budget resolution is not the law. Okay, all this does is it allows us to continue the process, begin drafting the actual legislation that really counts, and that's the one big, beautiful bill.
Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, earlier today discussing his goal of getting a budget framework approved in the House this week. Though on the early edition of Balance of Power today, we spoke with Republican Congressman Pat Fallon, Texas, who had reservations about whether House Republicans could secure enough votes to make that happen. Listen.
It's going to be a challenge, to be very honest. I don't know if we're going to have the votes. I hope we do, because all this is doing is this is, like you said, it's a blueprint to move the process forward. There will be then a final product. We need to work toward balancing a budget moving forward, considering we have a $36 trillion debt and climbing. We need to take our fiscal responsibility seriously, not just on the campaign trail, but actually here in Washington, D.C. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen.
We seek wisdom from Lisa Camooso Miller, host of the Friday Reporter podcast, former communications director for the Republican National Committee, and formerly of another Republican speaker's office. It's great to have you back. Thank you. So this is just a question about whether we get the framework done. Mm-hmm. And I'll narrow it down even more. Forget the floor right now. Can it even get through the Rules Committee?
Well, it looks like Mr. Roy has some thoughts about it, and he's on the Rules Committee and has a pretty loud loud voice on the Rules Committee.
So how difficult is this going to be?
It's going to be very difficult. And I think that it's very nice to hear the Speaker say that he wants all of this done. I also have some reservations about, it seems like there are so many factions that have questions about what's here. It's not just the Freedom Caucus. It's not just, it sounds like there is a lot of work to be done before this can come to a vote.
Well, even the chair of the Budget Committee, Jody Arrington, has expressed some reservations. To what extent, Lisa, do you think, though, the Speaker is counting on President Trump to be the one that ultimately twists the arms and moves the needle and gets the votes? Because Trump met with some Republican holdouts at the White House today, but my sense emerging from that meeting is not that necessarily enough minds were changed.
I also think that, well, I mean, Washington is weird right now, and maybe this is the way that we're going to be doing our life for a long time. But to me, what leaves a question in the back of my mind, too, is how much capital the president has already expended with the tariffs and the decisions that he made last week and what may go into effect in just a few hours now. That, to me, makes me wonder whether or not he has as much sway with these members who are already on the bubble as he once did.
Well, okay, so let's go there for a minute, because this has been a big question here. Will the tariff story interfere with the reconciliation story? These are both promises made on the campaign trail. Donald Trump decides to bite both off at once. But you heard Tom Tillis earlier. If this doesn't work out, whose throat can I choke? How long can that go on when President Trump starts making phone calls to vote yes on bills?
Well, you know, I also think that the president himself is probably looking to the Speaker to take the heavy lift on this particular package as well. As much as it's the president's desire to get this done, I think also, too, Trump is probably saying everyone else needs to do their job around here, and he probably doesn't want to expend any extra capital than he has to.
The idea, though, that it shakes unity in the party is a real thing or not?
I think that the market and the market's behavior over the course of the last 4 days absolutely has people very concerned. And I know it's only been 4 days, but that's a lot of time for them to have heard. They were home for the last weekend. They're about to go home for a long week now, the recess. To me, it feels like this is definitely shakier ground than the president has been on before with the conference, especially with the need to get the resolution done and then to get on to reconciliation.
And perhaps that manifested in the words of Tom Tillis and Jamison Greer's hearing in the Senate Finance Committee, to the point Joe was just making. And in that same hearing, we also got this bit of news from the Democratic ranking member, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, on his new resolution to curb tariff policy.
Today, I am proposing a new bipartisan privileged resolution to end the latest crop of global tariffs that are clobbering American families and small businesses.
We saw a narrower in scope resolution sponsored by Tim Kaine pass in the Senate earlier this month, Lisa. Do you think that this stands a chance? And even if it gets through the Senate, what's its future in the House, realistically?
I don't think it stands a chance. I even saw that Senator Grassley had proposed a piece of legislation, and the majority leader said no. So I feel like there is a lot of pushback. Yes, the senators are speaking up. I'm sure it's because they're feeling it in their own retirement accounts, right? But I don't think that it has a lot of legs, and I don't think that it's going to make a lot of difference, which, back to the balance of power and the show that we're on today, seems to me like we're out of balance right now in a big way.
Lisa Camooso Miller. So is your former House of Representatives powerless right now?
It really feels like they've ceded a lot of their power to the president. And that, to me, either can stay the same and leave the president with a lot of power, or there can be a shift. And it feels to me like right now is a time to keep an eye on. I'm not necessarily sure that anybody's really going to walk away from supporting the president from the conference, but it certainly does feel like a time where if the market doesn't remedy itself, and if these members are not only having to answer for the fact that people's retirement accounts have been reduced, they're also going to have to answer for the fact that they're taking some difficult votes here in Washington, and they have re-elections coming up in just 18 months. There's a lot of movement there that I think that we should keep a very close eye on.
Finally, just in our final minute here, Lisa, there's obviously been a bit of a public spat happening within the administration between Elon Musk and the trade advisor for President Trump, Peter Navarro. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary today, said boys will be boys and suggested they're going to continue to let them duke it out in public. What does that do to the White House's communication around these issues?
you know, in a previous administration, everyone would be not at the White House anymore. But the way that we do business these days is a little bit different. I think Elon Musk is on his way out. I think Peter Navarro has survived a long 8 years, and he's back in the White House. And I think he has the president's ear. So I suspect that, I mean, I don't think that that was a serious answer that the press secretary gave today, and I certainly would not have given that answer myself. But I also think that Peter Navarro probably survives, and Elon Musk probably goes away.
Wow.
Well, maybe that's why Elon feels comfortable publicly declaring Peter Navarro a, quote, moron.
Yeah, that was the nicer tweet of the day.
Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC Communications Director, thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on Balance of Power, as we're now just about 6 hours away from reciprocal tariffs taking effect. We'll have more on that next on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and it's just about to turn 6 p.m. on the East Coast, which means we are now about 6 hours from reciprocal tariffs that are set to take effect at midnight tonight. And, of course, no country going to be hit harder, it seems, than China, as the White House confirmed today. Its intent is when the clock strikes midnight, 104% levies will be implemented on all Chinese imports.
As President Trump says, he's waiting for their call. And that also means with 6 o'clock futures will open. I'll be very curious to see what markets think about this after our topsy-turvy day here. We'll have a lot more tomorrow. The beginning of the rest of our lives, apparently, with reciprocal tariffs. Read much more about it in the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And, of course, we'll have full coverage, as always, for you tomorrow on both the early and this late edition of Balance of Power. So we'll see you then on Bloomberg TV and radio.